Thank you, President Shane. Well, hello, Stillwater Frontier Rotary Club. How is everybody? Good? All right. We're going to have a little fun with this introduction, okay? Now, this is the thing. I'm going to ask you a question, but you have to raise your hand and get the microphone, or Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible back there, will slap a fine on you. Okay? So here is my question. How many of you... Oh, ooh, big dollars. Ooh. So, how many of you are related to someone famous? Anybody? Surely, even distantly. Okay, I see a hand go up. Okay, microphone needs to go to this gentleman. Who are you related to?
5 different presidents.
Wow. Anybody else? Did I see a hand over here? Okay, yeah, a couple here.
Some chief of the Cherokees, I don't remember the name, and Abraham Lincoln, ironically.
Ooh. Okay. Chris, I bet it's Mel Gibson or somebody, right? Now.
Yeah, I just raised my hand because I didn't think anyone would call on me. My sister's an actress and has been Seinfeld and As the World Turns and August Osage County, and she's spoken here before.
Wow.
So, yeah. She doesn't reciprocate when they ask her if she knows he wasn't famous. So.
Okay, Richard.
My connection, being from Kentucky, everybody in Kentucky is related to Daniel Boone. But we have a direct lineage to him, and our family farm is still on the Kentucky River, 4 miles from Fort Boonesboro, and has been since 1796. 1796.
All right, anyone? Okay.
This might be a stretch, but my father-in-law has done his genealogy and found that one of his ancestors was neighbors to John Adams.
Okay.
I think that's
All
a
right.
fine.
So our speaker today, Dr. Jim Rutledge, is a relative of one of Abe Lincoln's earliest girlfriends. Yeah, you heard me right. Honest Abe, girlfriends. So when I reached out to Jim to get biographical information to introduce him today, he was very modest in what he sent me. So I'd like to share just a little bit about some of the great things this man has done. He's invested his entire career as a 4-H professional, and he spent about 30 of those years here at OSU. He served as the state 4-H leader. That's the head clover, all right? And he was also executive director of the Oklahoma 4-H Foundation. He's received awards and recognition at the highest national level for his lifetime of service to youth through 4-H. And he's just a tireless community servant here in Stillwater. And I think he just exemplifies the 4-H model of making the best better. So a great mentor and friend to me of many years, and I'm very grateful for that. So Jim is originally from a small town north of Springfield, Illinois. Ever since he learned that his 6th cousin was one of Abraham Lincoln's earliest girlfriends, he has been interested in telling Mr. Lincoln's stories. Now join me in welcoming Mr. Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States.
Thank you, Kathy. I think I'm mic'd up. I think I'm mic'd up. Can you hear me, Roger? Okay. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I've got a lot of other comments I want to make today, so I'm going to avoid calling out all the people I see in the room that I know because there's so many of you. This is a very distinguished group, and it's an honor for me to be with you here today. Now, some of you are thinking he doesn't look like Abraham Lincoln. His hair is too white, and he's too short. Well, who knows when I was born? 1809. So middle of next week, how old will I be? Come on, 215. So when you're 215 years old, how many of you expect to have dark hair? That's what I thought. Well, as for my height, I have settled a little bit. I've been going to way too many of these luncheons, and I'm more round than I am tall these days. So let me start. The first part of my presentation today is going to be about facts and fake news. And then we're going to talk about some of the things that Lincoln did besides win the Civil War. So to get started, here's a few facts to start with. I was the first president born outside of the original 13 colonies. I was the tallest man to ever be president at 6'4". Trump, regardless of anything he may tell you, is only 6'3". They say my shoe size is between 12 and 14. Now, for some reason, they never wanted to say that I wore a size 13 shoe, but that's the truth. I wore a size 13 shoe. I had only about 1 year of formal schooling, a combination of several months on several different times, less than any other president in history. And I was admitted to the bar without ever attending any formal training, and not only to the bar, but to the Supreme Court, where I did take one case, which I lost. It was a relatively inconsequential case about the statute of limitations. And I think they hired me because I was in the House of Representatives at the time, and the Supreme Court was in the basement of the Capitol building. So I didn't have to walk very far to represent the client. I do not like being called Abe. I will forgive you if that's how you refer to me, but I don't like that. I prefer Abraham, Mr. Lincoln, or Mr. President. So that's just a little something to remember. And I signed all of my personal correspondence. Who knows how I signed all of my personal correspondence? Correct. Simply A. Lincoln. No Abraham, no Abe, just A. Lincoln. Now, I love animals, and I never hunted or fished, but I did something that a lot of people don't really like to know about. I let my favorite cat eat at the table in the White House. Now, I do like to wrestle, or as we called it in those days, wrestle. And I've been told that over the years they've counted up about 300 matches, all of which I won except for one, which was against a brute during the time that I served in the militia during the Black Hawk War. And I had one draw with Jack Armstrong, and we agreed to call it a draw and became the best of friends. When things were bad and I didn't have a job and didn't have any money, Jack's family took me in and fed me and gave me a place to sleep. Now, today I have a special exhibit in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame just around the corner. So if you've ever been there, you've seen my exhibit. Well, you probably knew some of those things, but I hope I'm going to share some facts with you that you are not aware of. I had no idea my life would be so interesting, but you might be interested to know that there have been over 16,000 books written about me since 1865. That's an average of one book every 3.5 days, or 100 books a year for the past 150 years. Now, some of those are very good books. I won't say very much about the others. You will notice that I'm using my notes today for this presentation. And you should understand that in my day, when you gave a speech, there was a reporter there, and they would transcribe that, and newspapers would pick that up all over the country. So you think the internet is fast today, and it is. But in my day, anything you said would be recorded and would be passed around for weeks or months. So it wasn't like the garbage that shows up on the internet today, which is gone tomorrow because there's new garbage to take its place. The stuff that I was saying got printed and repeated and shared in the whole community. So I have to be very careful about what I say. Therefore, I control my tongue by writing it out, and so you will notice today that I'm going to use my notes. You know that I was born in Kentucky to Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks Lincoln. And yes, Tom Hanks would be a distant relative of my mother's. And I need to visit with the person over here that said they were related to me. So we'll have to figure that out, because I I have no direct descendants. I'm sure I have cousins, but I have no direct descendants. My mother died of milk poisoning when I was only 9. My father then married Sarah Bush Johnston. Now, this was a fateful event because it was my stepmother that encouraged me to read, and she told me I could become whatever I wanted. And I probably never would have been president or even a lawyer if it hadn't been for my stepmother and her encouragement. Now, the custom in my day was that any young person was considered the property of his father until he was 21 years old. And so my father liked, because I was a strong young man, my father liked to sell me out to the neighbors as a laborer. But he got to keep all the money until I was 21. And that's why when I turned 21, I immediately left home. I was ready to be on my own, and that's when I moved to New Salem, Illinois. Regrettably, I was never close to my father, and when he died, I did not even attend his funeral. I did remain close to my stepmother, however, and visited her just before my last trip to Washington, D.C. Some say that I had serious depression issues. Now, there were times when I could be melancholy, but consider this. My mother died when I was 9. My father lost several farms in Kentucky because of sloppy land records and disputes over ownership. The family moved no less than 6 times through Indiana and Illinois, several times clearing timber to make farmland before being forced to move again. My sister Sarah died in childbirth when I was 19. Mary Todd Lincoln and I had 4 sons. Robert, the oldest, lived to be an adult, but the other 3 sons all died young. Eddie was 4 when he died in Springfield in 1850. Willie was 11 when he died in the White House in 1862. Tad was alive until 1871 when he died at age 18. My first sweetheart died in 1835, probably of typhoid fever, while I was still living there in New Salem. I failed at business in 1831 and again in 1833. I just was not meant to be a shopkeeper. I lost the election for the Illinois state legislature in 1832. I ran for U.S. Representative twice and lost, and for the Senate twice and lost. I ran for Vice President in 1856 and lost. As a circuit riding lawyer, I was away from home for several months every year, staying in boarding houses, sharing rooms with other lawyers or the judge, while Mary and the children were back home. And we didn't have FaceTime or internet to keep in touch. Is it any wonder that I could have been depressed? On the other hand, I did serve 6 years in the Illinois state legislature and was elected to 1 term as a representative to D.C. And my debates with Stephen Douglas, who beat me for the Senate seat in 1858, gave me the visibility and reputation that led to my nomination for president. I actually won the popular vote against Douglas, but at that time senators were elected by the state legislature, and the Democrats controlled the state house. I believe there was some fate involved. Imagine what would have happened if I had gone to Washington in 1858. I would not have run for president in 1860. As president, I was commander-in-chief, but in my younger days, I was a failure as a military officer. In 1832, I joined the Illinois militia to fight in the Black Hawk Wars. Tall and strong, I was elected the captain. However, after 1 month, I resigned that position and re-enlisted as a private. The position I held for 2 more months before being released. I never saw any action, but I did get to bury several others that were killed in an Indian attack. I never got the knack of marching orders. Once when we came to a narrow gate in a pasture, I was not sure how to reduce the column from 2 down to 1 and then expand it back out to 2 on the other side of the gate. So I pulled a little trick on everybody and called a halt and told everyone at ease. When you reform, please do so on the other side of the gate. That was the extent of my military training and my expertise in marching. Well, during my time in New Salem, which was 1831 to 1837, I had a few jobs. I was a flatboat captain, a river pilot, a clerk, a surveyor, postmaster, rail splitter, state legislator, and store owner. Most people liked me and thought of me as an honest man, but I never liked being called Honest Abe. But then, as now, some things are useful in a campaign. One short story about my business failure. After a couple years of the Lincoln Berry store, I assumed all the debts of the store and took the next 15 years to pay it off. I called it the national debt. Most didn't expect this since I technically didn't own the store anymore, but that was the right thing to do because it hurt other people. I thought it was my duty to take care of those debts. Now some of the fake news that even I still hear today in the news or on what you call the internet. Have you ever heard that I was gay? Nobody's ever proved the assertion, and this is based primarily on the fact that I shared a bed with several different men over the years. When I first moved to New Salem, I boarded at the Rutledge Tavern, operated by John Rutledge. When I finish my remarks, you can ask Jim Rutledge about that. In those days, a tavern was actually a boarding house. The family lived in a couple of rooms downstairs, and that left the upstairs to be rented to single men that were traveling and needed a place to stay. When I traveled on the circuit, there were many times that multiple lawyers shared a room. How about the opposing judge or those other lawyers? Were they also gay? This was a very common practice at the time and much preferred to sleeping on the floor. On the other hand, I would list my 4 sons as sufficient proof of my sexuality. Have you ever heard that I was an atheist? That's another common myth that's going around. Well, this could not be further from the truth. Do you know what church I belong to? None. My father was a Baptist, but I never joined an organized church. Part of it was because of the hypocrisy that I saw in the organized churches and tent revivals I witnessed as a child. While in the White House, my family and I attended the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. As a young man, there were several books in the cabin that I read: Aesop's Fables, The Life of George Washington, and the Bible. I read the Bible every day, and many of my stories and object lessons, including some I used in court, come straight from the parables of the Bible. Almost all of my most famous speeches include references to God. Here I can quote some items that I said or wrote that have been published. And as a lawyer, I will use these as evidence of my faith. In regards to this great book, meaning the Bible, I have but to say it is the best gift God has given to man. All the good the Savior gave to the world was communicated through this book, but for it we could not know right from wrong. All things most desirable for man's welfare, here and hereafter, are found portrayed in it. From my farewell speech as I left Springfield for the last time, and this was one of the few impromptu speeches that I had given at the time. Did not know that I was going to make a speech, but as the train was preparing to leave, I was pressed upon to make some comments, and this was then published in the local paper. At the time I said, trusting in Him who can go with me and remain with you and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To His care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell. March 4th, 1865, I said this: fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. with malice toward none, and charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish that work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. Do you recognize those comments? What were those? Second inaugural address. Right. Now, if that does not express my belief in God, I don't think anything would. The House Divided speech, which is taken primarily from the gospel books of the Bible, specifically Matthew 12, verse 25, Jesus said, "Every kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and every city or household divided against itself will not stand." In my 1858 speech, excuse me, in Springfield, Illinois, when the Republican Party nominated me to run for the Senate against Stephen Douglas, I said this: "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." Okay, so I hope that's sufficient evidence of my faith in God. Have you heard that I'm a racist? It's another terrible fake news going around. Well, have any of you ever changed the way you looked at a complex situation? I have, and that's the origin of the claims that I'm a racist. I assure you that I have always been opposed to slavery. But in August of 1862, in a letter to Horace Greeley, I wrote the following: "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." To put this in context, I should tell you that 1 month before I wrote this letter to Mr. Greeley, I had already drafted the Emancipation Proclamation and had shared the draft with my cabinet. Clearly, my plan was the third option, to free the slaves in the Confederate States and then to work on the 13th Amendment to permanently free all the slaves in both the North and South. For an accurate view of my work to pass the 13th Amendment, I recommend the latest movie based on Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, The Team of Rivals. If you have not read that, I would recommend it. As president, it was my first duty to save the Union, but that does not change the fact that I had every intention of fighting to end slavery. The letter in itself was a response to an article that Mr. Greeley had published in his paper criticizing me for not taking more direct action against slavery. I was reminding him of my first obligation as president of the whole United States of America. It is also true that in the early days, Frederick Douglass thought I moved too slowly to engage his brethren in the war effort or to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. As a very astute politician, I knew that I had to maintain certain positions to hold on to the border states. Without the border states, the war was surely lost. As Mr. Douglass came to understand my view, we became very good friends, and he became one of my strongest supporters in the press. From the beginning, I believed that all men, black men, white men, others, had the right to improve their condition in society and to enjoy the fruits of their labor. In this way, they were equal to white men, and for this reason, slavery was inherently unjust. I will admit again that my views on the solution to the issue of slavery evolved during my lifetime, but I never approved of slavery. The sad news is that some authors have taken my evolutionary views and used them to write entire books to accuse me of not being against slavery. Here's a few quotes that have been published that represent my true views of slavery. Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on them personally. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. Thus expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. So you can be assured that I was always against slavery from the very first time that I saw it being exercised in New Orleans after a flatboat ride down the Mississippi. Well, let's talk for just a minute about elections. You know, I did not even go to the Republican convention in Chicago in 1860. My friend, Judge David Davis, was my campaign manager. I stayed in Springfield and let Judge Davis handle it for me. I knew him from the circuit. I'm sure there were times we shared a room or even a bed, and there were times when Judge Davis was not available that I filled in as the judge for certain cases. Well, here's a little known fact to let you know that some things in politics never change. Judge Davis had counterfeit tickets printed to get my supporters into the hall of the Wigwam in Chicago. The whole process would take an hour to explain, but needless to say, the judge was successful in getting me nominated on the third ballot over several better-known candidates. Politics is politics, and I have to admit that in return for his help with my campaign, I appointed Judge Davis to the Supreme Court in 1862. How many speeches do you think I gave? And how many miles do you think I rode the train between the nomination in May of 1860 and my election in November? 0. 0. I never gave or published a new campaign speech after I received the nomination. I believed that my reputation had already established itself, and anything I might say could only take away votes I might otherwise get. Don't you think some of today's candidates would do better if they followed that practice? On November 6, 1860, I was elected the 16th President of the United States, beating Stephen A. Douglas, John C. Breckinridge of the Southern Democrats, and John Bell of the new Constitutional Union Party. I was the first president from the Republican Party. My victory was entirely due to the strength of my support in the North and West. I did not get a single vote from 10 of the 15 southern states, and I won only 2 of 996 counties in all of the southern states. This was before the Civil War started, but everyone knew my position on slavery. I received 1.8 million votes, less than 40%. Douglas received 1.3 million. Breckinridge, 800,000, and Bell, almost 600,000. Turnout, now listen carefully, turnout was 82.2% of those eligible to cast a vote. I won the free northern states as well as California and Oregon. But can you believe 82%? Shouldn't we strive for that today? Although I only won by a plurality of the popular vote, my victory in the Electoral College was decisive. I had 180, and my opponents added together had only 123. Let me close this section of my remarks with a few quick facts. My oldest son, Robert, was the only one to survive to adulthood. He had 3 children, but no blood heirs, so I have no descendants to this day. I am the only president to have a patent. I invented a device to free steamboats that ran aground. I wanted women to have the vote in 1836 and declared the same in a published newspaper campaign in New Salem, where I said, I go for all sharing the privileges of the government who assist in bearing its burdens. Consequently, I go for admitting all whites to the right of suffrage who pay taxes or bear arms, by no means excluding females. I don't smoke, drink, or chew, and I never drank in the White House. Can you imagine 4 years of the Civil War and I never took a drink? I don't have a middle name. I was the first president to use the telegraph. I was the first president with a beard. 8 of the next all had beards, and there have been none since then. Maybe they should bring it back into style. I was shot on Good Friday. John Wilkes Booth was at my second inaugural address in March of 1865. Booth's brother saved my son Robert on a New Jersey train platform when he pulled him up away from the train after he fell off. Someone shot at me in 1864 and put a hole in my hat while I was riding alone on my way back to Old Soldiers' Home. My suits were made by Brooks Brothers. My guest at Ford's Theater that evening was to be Ulysses Grant, but his wife did not like Mary at all, and so they canceled at the last minute. Legislation to create the Secret Service was on my desk on the day that we went to the theater, but it was primarily for the suppression of counterfeiting, which it still is today. Besides protecting the president, the Secret Service is tasked with finding counterfeiters. I told my bodyguard on April 14th of 1865 that I had dreamed about being assassinated for 3 nights in a row. My trip to the theater was that evening. I never slept in the Lincoln bedroom. I used the current Lincoln bedroom as my personal office. It was there that I met cabinet members and signed documents, including the Emancipation Proclamation. So I hope that you've learned something from that short rendition about some of the facts and fake news. Now I'd like to talk to you about some of the things that I accomplished during my tenure besides winning the Civil War. And I think you will, especially in this room, you will appreciate some of these. Everyone knows that I was president during the Civil War and that we eventually won that war, freed the slaves, and saved the Union. But you may not remember a number of the other significant things that we accomplished in the middle of that terrible war. Today, I would like to remind you of some of those things that still have an impact on your lives today. Some of you will like, and at least one you may not appreciate. Some of these were connected to the war effort, even though today we do not normally connect them. I was born on a poor farm in Kentucky in the midst of pioneer farming on the western frontier of America. My work as a farmhand gave me an understanding and experience for what it means to cultivate the land and produce a successful harvest. After I left my agricultural roots to pursue politics, I never lost my passion for developing better education and government recognition of agriculture. Speaking of that, when I was nominated for the Republican Party for the presidency, I made known the priority that agriculture would hold in my political platform. Once elected, my primary focus was maintaining the Union in the midst of the Civil War. But I also managed to enact or sign 4 agricultural proposals that affect the state of American agriculture today. As president, I did not write any of these acts, but I did support and encourage each one. And in some case, I asked colleagues in Congress to write the legislation so that I could sign it. These 4 actions are still having an impact on our society today. We signed legislation to establish the Department of Agriculture, the Homestead Act, an act for the construction of the Union Pacific Central Pacific Railroad, and the Morrill Land Grant College Act. My goal in approving these important pieces of legislation were twofold. First, I wish to encourage settlement of the West, which would accelerate its commercial, industrial, and agricultural development. Secondly, I sought to establish a Western population that was sympathetic to the Union cause. I, along with most in Congress, feared the prospect of a negotiated peace with the South, knowing full well that victorious Southerners would attempt to expand into the West and take slavery with them. The Republican Party was formed in 1854 to oppose the spread of slavery to the West, and in 1862 I meant to continue that opposition even in the event that the Confederacy gained its independence. By populating the West with Union sympathizers, technology, and institutions, I hope to avoid a future civil war by denying Southerners the opportunity to expand westward. Now, a word about each of those 4 acts. On May 15, 1862, I signed an act of Congress that established the early beginnings of the USDA. I believed that agriculture was the largest interest in the nation, and I called it the People's Department because agriculture was so important to our economy and to the war effort. In the 1860s, half of the country's population was engaged in agriculture. So it was important for us to find better ways to serve that population, knowing that I was going to have to feed up to 600,000 soldiers made agricultural production even more important. I appointed Isaac Newton, an innovative agriculturalist from Pennsylvania, to serve as the head of the agricultural sector of the Patent Office. And when the USDA was formally created, he became the first Commissioner of Agriculture. His objectives were to collect data, introduce new plants and animals, testing agricultural equipment, analyzing soils, grains, fruits, plants, and vegetables, and establishing an agricultural library and museum. These initial objectives shaped the legislation that created the USDA, much as it is today. America's farmers responded to our call for produce to keep the Army on its feet. Each month during the Civil War, farmers produced and provided almost 50,000 bushels of beans. Imagine the effect that had. 8.5 million pounds of potatoes, 24 million pounds of fresh beef, and over 130,000 barrels of flour. I think the USDA was a pretty good idea. In 1861, when 11 states withdrew from the Union, we had a new government. Those southern states called their elected representatives and senators home. This gave us the opportunity to bring up legislation that had long been stalled in Congress. One of those was the idea that homesteading could help us expand into the western regions of the country. The Homestead Act gave 160 acres of federal land in the West to settlers for free, provided they live on and develop the land. All but Confederate soldiers could apply. This free parcel of land was intended as a way to help poor Americans get a foothold and build something from their own labor. When asked my thoughts on the act, I said, I think that the wild lands of the country should be distributed so that every man should have the means and opportunity of benefiting his condition. I signed the Homestead Act on May 20th of 1862. Our Homestead Acts eventually led to the transfer of 10% of American land to private ownership. These acts and subsequent laws passed in its mold redistributed 420,000 square miles of American land into 1.6 million homesteads. This move was indirectly related to the Civil War and the reason it had not been approved by Congress before 1861. The Homestead Acts opened up the western land at a time when Southerners were less likely to migrate. Oklahoma was not subject to the original Homestead Act, but what we have today was made possible by later Homestead Acts. I think it was a gloriously successful idea. The next one, the Railroad Act, was passed in the absence of the Southern delegation, where the Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific joined, authorizing a transcontinental railroad connecting California to the east. You know, California became a state in 1850, but it was isolated by the Rocky Mountains. Plus, California supported me for president, and I am, after all, a politician. We knew the railroad would cut travel time to California down to 8 days, opening the West to massive migration. It also helped farmers get their produce from the West and the Midwest to the more heavily populated areas in the East. The government, with its limited money reserved for the war, could not afford to undertake the colossal infrastructure project. So Congress outsourced the work. The government granted land rights to private companies, which the companies then sold to third-party developers, which then funded the engineering and construction of the railroads. In this fashion, the railroad companies gained huge fortunes and political power, and the government turned tracts of empty land into a railroad across America. The first Railroad Act was signed July 1st, 1862. I personally chose the railroad's starting point in the east, Council Bluffs, Iowa, across the river from Omaha. And that was a political bone for the Iowa caucus's presidential support. I also ensured that the railroad ran along the northern route rather than the southern route. The southern route had been the one preferred by southern politicians prior to the Civil War. And now the act that many of you are directly involved in. How many of you, either now or at some time, have been affiliated with Oklahoma State University? Okay, pretty big percentage of you. The land-grant college idea originated, at least in part, with Jonathan Baldwin Turner, a professor at Illinois College in Jacksonville, Illinois. Professor Turner worked tirelessly for years to convince Illinois and the nation to create a system of higher education for all citizens. He initially worked with Illinois Senator Lyman Trumbull. Trumbull was supportive of the idea, but felt it would be better coming from a representative from New England. Vermont Representative Justin Smith Morrill was asked to champion the bill and became an enthusiastic supporter. A bill to create the land-grant system was offered in the House in 1857, but did not pass. It was offered again in 1858, but it did not pass the Senate. Finally, in 1859, it passed both houses, but it was vetoed by President Buchanan. He happened to be a wealthy graduate of Dickinson College, a private college in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I was approached by Professor Turner during the campaign for president. I knew of Turner because some of his students helped me learn proper grammar while I was a young man, just beginning to study the law. Before the Republican convention in 1860, Turner himself told me that he thought I would be nominated for president and that I would be elected. I told him, quote, "If I am, I will sign your bill for state universities." I was proud to sign the Morrill Land-Grant College Act on July 2nd, 1862. At the time, I said this: "The land-grant university system is being built on behalf of the people who have invested in these public universities their hopes, their support, and their confidence." And, of course, as most of you in this room know, the rest is history. The act specified that public universities in the states could have an initial endowment of federal lands. This gave fledgling universities land to build their schools. It also gave them enough land to sell, to provide money to construct their buildings and libraries. The principle of the Morrill Acts was similar to the Homestead and Railroad Acts, transferring public lands to private hands to stimulate development and increase wealth. Well, now several things not related to agriculture that we also did. Reforming the banking sector and passing the National Banking Act of 1863 was another important step in fighting the war. We knew that a stable banking system was critical to our ability to fund the war. However, very few presidents since the birth of the nation ever embarked on instituting reforms in the banking system. Amidst all the chaos of the Civil War, we were determined to establish strong pillars within the nation's financial sector. Furthermore, with adequate reforms in the banking sector, the banks were more able and willing to give us credit to fund infrastructure projects and to fund the war. Internal improvements were one of the pillars of my campaign for the presidency. Out of this initiative also came a national currency. The almighty dollar was first printed under my administration in 1863. The note currency is the immediate precursor to the present-day dollar. Astonishingly, though, as it may seem, before 1863 there were no federal currencies. Numerous local currencies were issued by banks. In principle, you could redeem your money for precious metals at the specific bank where it was issued. Andrew Jackson had set the stage when, in populist fury, he revoked the charter of the National Bank 30 years earlier. The war made the creation of a standard currency a necessity. I realized that borrowing from banks was inefficient and insufficient to fund the Union Army. By printing our own bills, we could have unlimited access to money at a favorable rate. I'm sorry to see what you've done to the dollar today with all of your deficit spending. While it was essential during the Civil War, I'm not sure I see the necessity of it today. Now, this is the one you may not want me to take credit for, but the preservation of the Union made it essential. Up to the time of the Civil War, America was financed through tariffs, bonds, and other taxes. To fund the war, we had to explore other options under the Constitution. We created America's first ever income tax in 1861. I'm the one. This first ever income tax rate was 3% flat tax on all income over $600. This was soon changed to a progressive scale where, based on income level, citizens paid either 5%, 3%, or nothing. We also started the policy of withholding taxes from workers' pay. Taxes without collection and enforcement don't produce revenue, so we also created the Office of the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, which became the IRS. We all know the importance of April 15th. That just happens to be the day after my fateful trip to Ford's Theater and the day of my ultimate demise. Some justice. Speaking of April 14th, that was also the day I created the Secret Service. Too bad their job was not to protect the president. However, the Secret Service was dedicated to fighting currency counterfeiting. Counterfeit money was a big problem. Fake money weakened the integrity of the currency and caused inflation. Secret Service agents were commissioned to find and arrest people who were illegally printing money. Though today primarily known as the agency that protects the president, the Secret Service continues to serve its original function in finding counterfeiters. The last thing today that I want to talk about is creating the official Thanksgiving holiday. From the time of the Pilgrims until my time in office, our country had informally celebrated Thanksgiving. I believe in the value of giving thanks, and I first ordered government offices closed on November 28, 1861. Then in the fall of 1863, I got a letter from Sarah Joseph Hale urging that we create a formal Thanksgiving holiday. By the way, Mrs. Hale wrote the poem, Mary Had a Little Lamb. Anyway, I felt it was time to begin looking for ways to bring us all back together as a country. On October 3rd, 1863, I issued the Thanksgiving Proclamation, which declared the last Thursday of November to be a day of thanksgiving and praise to our beneficent Father who dwelleth in the heavens, and asked for the interposition of the Almighty hand to heal the wounds of the nation and to restore peace, harmony, and union. Prior to my proclamation, the only two national holidays were Independence Day and Washington's birthday. I understand that President Franklin Roosevelt changed the date to the next to last Thursday of November in order to make the Christmas holiday shopping season a week longer. Little did he know that today it would start the day after 4th of July. Well, I hope that you have learned something not only about the facts around my life, but some of the things that we've done that you still benefit from today. Now, I would be more than happy to take a couple of questions if anyone has a question for Mr. Lincoln. Any questions for Mr. Lincoln? Yes, sir.
Go ahead, Larry. He's coming.
As a former member affiliated with Oklahoma State University, I've heard about Section 13 money in Oklahoma. So where did the every 13th section, where did that idea come from? Was it from the feds or was it from the state? And secondly, why the number 13?
Well, that's really not a question that I know the details on at this point. I know that particularly railroad land was in alternating sections in order to avoid giving any developer a huge block of land in one place. I also know that there's been some controversy over the assignment of federal lands for the land-grant universities because some of that was taken out of sections of the federal land that was currently occupied by the Native American tribes.
Okay, for the sake of time, thank you very much. Miss